Have you ever dreaded being around those people because you knew it would get political? What if the reason it feels so threatening isn't about them at all, but it's actually about the way your brain is wired for sides? And what if you could train that wiring? You're listening to Relish, the podcast for people ready to stop chasing self-improvement and start savoring their lives. If you're tired of the hamster wheel of healing and hungry for more joy, presence, and meaning, you're in the right place. Welcome to Relish. I am your host, Alyssia, and before we get into today's conversation, I want to set a clear container. We will be talking about polarization and conflict and the ways that our brains are wired for polarization, for sides. And the invitation today is to be present. So consider not listening to this one on double speed if that's typical for you. Just let it land. I want to acknowledge this is going to be a longer episode than typical, at least for my typical. Perhaps rather than an entree, as I call them, you can kind of think about this one as a fully coursed out meal. I did debate breaking this up into two, but I think the whole thing serves as an experience that's kind of like a journey. Now, listen to yourself. If you need to pause, take a break, please do that. That's more than okay. Come back when your system feels ready. Today is not about opinions. I am not judging anyone's opinions. I'm not trying to persuade anyone to change opinions. Today is about giving insight into what's happening in your brain so that whatever it is that you believe, you can choose how you want to relate to it, to have more control over it. And that's why this episode is longer than most. You really can't cherry pick one part of the episode and get the whole message. It needs to be taken all together as a whole. I also want to be clear that this is not a space for dehumanizing language. So strong convictions are fine, boundaries are welcome, but the intention here is to see our shared humanity more clearly, even in the midst of difference. In this episode, we are talking specifically about the neuroscience of polarization, and we'll get into the neuroscience of ego. And we're going to discuss why disagreement actually feels like danger in your body. We're going to talk about why your brain craves the safety of sides and how you can practice staying open without giving up what matters most to you. You're going to hear science and stories and practical tools that will help you show up in conversations, especially the hard ones, hopefully with more clarity and steadiness and connection. So let's start with this. Your brain is wired for sides. This is not a flaw. It's more like a feature, and it's one that we can train. We don't have to look very far to see polarization in action today. You know, whether it's Charlie Kirk trending on social media, the genocide in Palestine, or the political divides in the US between Republicans and Democrats, these divides are very real. They're real and they impact our lives, our relationships, our sense of belonging. And right now, just notice what's happening inside. What are you feeling in your body and emotionally as I bring this up already? Just check in. And I'd actually like to start with an embodied practice so that you can have an anchor, something that you can come back to if anything does start to feel overwhelming today. And this is a tool that you can also take with you. All right. So if you'd like, you can leave your eyes open or you can close them if you prefer. It's up to you. But take a moment to settle into your body, to notice what's happening. Just scan through your body. Find a place that feels neutral or maybe even safe. It might be your hands resting on your lap or your palms on your thighs. It might be noticing your feet on the ground. It might be a hand on your heart. It might even be a position, a posture. Maybe like bending over while sitting, having your chest rest on your thighs, compressed. There's no right posture or part of your body, but find a spot that feels safe, supportive. And once you found that, let it be an anchor. It's anchoring you in the safety of this space. And this is a place that you can return to anytime. And that could be while you're listening to this episode or throughout your week or your day. Okay, so if you close your eyes, you can open them. This episode may be heavy. For some of you, it might challenge you in some ways, and I want to be transparent. I, of course, have opinions and judgments because I'm human and so do you. None of us gets away from that. But underneath those opinions, I believe something deeper. I believe no one is born evil. Babies are not born racist or vindictive. People experience pain, and that pain shapes them. There's a saying, hurt people hurt people. I believe that most people ultimately want the same thing. They want peace. People want peace, oneness, safety, belonging. It's the idea of what matters and how to get there that tends to differ. I also believe the path forward isn't about one side winning. That just perpetuates cycles of oppression and hate. The path to peace, I believe, is about healing pain and seeing people. So even though I may not know you personally, if you're listening to this, I know you have a good heart. I know that you care about compassion or you wouldn't be here. And that matters because here's what the science shows us. People can only reconsider deeply held views when they feel psychologically safe. Safety is built through curiosity, listening, acknowledging the human pain that's behind a position, even when we disagree. And my hope is that this conversation can be a safe space for you to reflect on yourself and your wiring. This is an episode I spent a lot of time on, a lot of intention creating, hours and hours. I do think it's helpful to have some of the foundational concepts from past episodes. The episode where I talk about binaries and fixed versus fluid mindsets, that was from mid-September, as well as last week's episode on compassion and self-compassion. Those will be really helpful to understand the difference between empathy and compassion, especially if you have a particularly sensitive or empathic system. It might help you potentially navigate it here. And remember, you have your anchor to come back to along the way. So with that, I'd like to do another brief embodied practice, guiding you through a short reflection of compassion in service of some of the teaching points I want to make. So go ahead and close your eyes if it feels safe, or if not, that's totally up to you. Remembering that right now, in this moment, you are safe and grounded. You're in your body, present. And I invite you to sit with the weight of suffering right now. Connecting to suffering that's happening around the world. War, violence. And take a moment to honor and perhaps grieve people who have been taken from their families. Just opening your heart to the people themselves, their families that are worried about them. And just allow yourself to touch into that, to feel compassion for that suffering, to want their suffering to be relieved. You're not taking it on as yours, but you're being aware of the pain. Compassion is wanting relief of suffering for a person or group. So right now, sending wishes of compassion to those people, the people who've been taken, the families worried about them. For just a moment, letting your heart open to them, while also knowing that you are safe right now. But you can keep your heart open and want them to be relieved of that suffering. You might offer a phrase, may you be safe. May you be healthy and well. May you be relieved of your suffering. And notice your own body sensations, your emotions in this moment, staying present to what's happening for you. And then just offering yourself compassion. Perhaps staying connected to that anchor, maybe having a hand on your heart, and offering yourself, may I be safe. May I be healthy and well. May I be relieved of my suffering. And notice what it's like to offer yourself that kindness. Take a deep breath. And feel yourself present, sitting. And you can allow your eyes to open if they were closed. I want to acknowledge that whatever happened for you in that experience is okay. There's no one or right thing that should have happened. I know you are a compassionate person. Regardless of your views, I know and believe that. So let's reflect for a moment. Where did your mind go in that experience? Where did your mind go? For some of you, images of people in Gaza may have surfaced. For others, people in Israel, maybe Sudan, Xinjiang, Azerbaijan, maybe somewhere else completely. Maybe you notice some discomfort, or maybe you notice yourself telling a story about me, trying to guess what side I'm on. Maybe you felt a sense of resistance or defensiveness or a desire to protect your side. And also notice that in that experience, I never specified a place. Wherever your attention went, there's no right or wrong. That is your compassion in action. And also, in some way, it's probably touching on your own pain. And that is also your brain doing what it's wired to do, orienting you toward a side. And that's not unrelated from your past experience and the pain you've experienced. Something that might feel radical to hear, having a side isn't actually the problem. What creates harm is when we become rigidly attached to it, when that side itself obscures our ability to stay connected to our values and our humanity. That is where, for me, mindfulness has been so powerful. I am a human. I am drawn to sides. Some of my viewpoints will probably come through today, but the intention isn't to share my view. And again, this is not a call for you to change yours. This is an opportunity to notice what arises for you and see how you relate to it and potentially learn some new skills and tools along the way. So please do use that anchor throughout the episode if you need, and take it with you during moments of activation. Whenever you locate safety in your body, your brain's threat system quiets down. This is happening in the brain, okay? And until we understand that, we have less control over our experience than we think. Let me start with a low-stakes example of polarization, okay? Imagine that you share an office with someone. And you like the thermostat set to 72 degrees, okay, we're talking Fahrenheit for my non-American listeners, and the other person, wants it set to 68 degrees. And you are convinced 72 is the right temperature. In fact, it's basically the only temperature anyone could find comfortable. And they are just as convinced of the opposite. 68 is the right temperature. Now, how are you coming to this decision? Your body is giving you signals. Maybe at 68 degrees, you are shivering, okay? But when it's 72 degrees, your temperature, the other person is sweating. And here's the thing, your brain's default mode network, the DMN, that's the brain's narrator, it starts building a story about why your preference is not only logical and fair, but maybe even the only reasonable choice. You know, it's like, it's freezing in here. How can anyone focus like this? Or maybe it's sweltering. I can't believe she's wearing a sweater. Notice how it feels true in your body. Your nervous system is literally confirming it for you. And it is true to your experience. But their brain, the other person's brain, is doing the exact same thing for their experience, which is true for them. This is how dualism works. Once we are in I'm right, you're wrong, the brain treats disagreement like a threat. And the amygdala, your brain's alarm system, is activated. And when that happens, resources are pulled away from the prefrontal cortex, which is where empathy and perspective taking and flexible thinking live. And at that point, the end game is win or lose. One of us has to give up our position. If I win, if I force the thermostat my way, you've lost your agency, and then you're resentful. And if you win, then I'm silenced. And in bigger contexts, this is how cycles of oppression happen. The oppressed can then become the oppressor by seeking to win in a way that erases the other side. Okay, this is deep. So what's the alternative? In some conflicts, we are not going to meet in the middle. There are moral lines we should never compromise. But here's what's true about human beings. The only way anyone changes their mind is if they feel safe enough to consider it. Safety starts in the body, and it comes from being seen and heard, even in their pain, even when you believe their position is harmful. It doesn't mean I agree. It means I am willing to hold space for your humanity. And that allows your defenses to soften just enough, maybe for a new perspective to get in, to be considered. And neuroscience backs this up. When the threat response lowers, the brain's salience and executive networks are re-engaged, making it possible to think flexibly and see nuance again. So if we go back to the thermostat, if I attack and judge you, it's so fucking cold in here, what's wrong with you for you, wanting it to be this cold? Your brain is hearing danger. And then you're just going to dig in deeper, no matter how right I believe I am. But if I can slow down and ask, what's driving your preference? I might learn that maybe you get migraines when it's too warm. Or maybe your arthritis flares when it's too cold. And you might learn about my poor circulation or how cold air worsens my breathing issues. These are not abstract preferences. They are lived realities in our body. You might not love my temperature, but you can probably understand my pain. And it's possible that I can understand yours. And in that space, you might be willing to adjust just a few degrees. Not because I forced you, but because it became safe enough in our humanity to see things differently. This is what I call sacred neutrality, and we're going to dive into it more later in the episode. But I am not avoiding choosing a temperature to keep the peace. That would be what I call compulsive straddling, and it's driven by fear of conflict or fear of judgment. Instead, I am consciously straddling, where I am aware of my stance, okay, I still have a stance, and I'm aware of yours. I definitely have an opinion and a truth, and I am choosing to engage in a way that keeps connection alive without giving up what matters to me. So notice the and, the both and, the fluid. I've talked about these concepts at length in previous episodes for a reason. Binaries, dualism, polarization. It's harmful. It's what leads to harm. And here's a bigger truth, that if we cannot practice this over a thermostat, something as small as a few degrees of air, what chance do we have in the conversations where the stakes are life and death? But if we can train ourselves here in the everyday, then we are preparing our brains and our nervous systems for the moments when it matters most. And this is where the neuroscience really helps us understand what's going on under the surface, why your side feels so true, why conflict can feel like a fight for survival. So let's talk about what's happening in the brain. The default mode network, that DMN, again, sometimes it's called the brain's narrator, it is running in the background almost all the time, and it's kind of stitching together your experiences into a coherent story of me. It's linking together your memories, your self-concept, your self-image, and your sense of continuity in time. And it's useful. Sometimes I hear people talk about the DMN and it kind of gets a bad rap. Like in mindfulness circles, there can be a sentiment that meditation is supposed to turn off your DMN. A, it's not. B, that's neurologically inaccurate. Okay, without your DMN, you wouldn't even know who you are. I think it's actually a gift of being human. But there is a cost when it's running the show without our awareness. So for instance, if my DMN is narrating a story about how, nobody in this room understands me, and I'm not aware of this story, the cost for me is that I will likely stay defensive, closed off to everyone around me, and only noticing how different I am and blind to any common ground that could be there. The DMN is also what fuels the me versus you lens. It's constantly reinforcing identity. What's mine, what's yours, what's ours, what's theirs. And when it's overactive, we can get stuck in rigid narratives, particularly about me or you. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm good, you're bad. It perpetuates dualism. When something challenges that identity, the brain experiences it as a kind of prediction error. Your inner story no longer matches what's actually happening in the present moment, and that feels threatening. That's where the amygdala, your brain's alarm system, it comes online and it dials up your sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response, and suddenly the salience network is flagging the disagreement as urgent, dangerous. Think about being in traffic when someone cuts you off. Okay, your body has a physical response. Your body might jolt, your heart rate goes up, your muscles tense, and this is before you can even think about it. It's compulsive. Your brain tags that driver that cut you off as the enemy. Me, I'm the safe, reasonable driver versus them, you, the reckless one. And that is the salience network flagging a threat and your amygdala flooding your system. Or another example, imagine maybe you share your opinion at a dinner table and someone dismisses it. It's not just words, okay? When they do that, you feel that. I feel that in my body. Maybe my chest tightens or my face, flushes. Your brain interprets that as pain because your DMN is saying, my voice matters. I belong here. And now that identity feels threatened. As human beings, we are wired for belonging. Our survival once depended on being a part of the group. So that rejection, it hits hard, it's painful. And the shift that's happening in your brain and in your nervous system, it pulls resources away from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain where that perspective taking, empathy, flexible thinking live, which is why when someone disagrees with us, it's not just annoying, it can feel dangerous. Disagreement gets processed in the brain in ways that overlap with physical pain. Like if you look at it in an fMRI machine. That's why polarization, it doesn't just feel intellectual, it feels embodied in your body. People think they are being rational, but it's usually very emotional. We just cannot see clearly when we are attached to a narrow view. So stay with me for a minute. We need to define a few terms before we get into this too deeply. So polarization. Polarization is when people split into two opposing camps. Us versus them, me versus you. It's division into poles, and it keeps us separate. And underneath that separation is pain. Most often, polarization happens because people don't feel seen or their pain hasn't been acknowledged. And when we feel that, we tend to cling harder to our pain, our side, as a way to protect ourselves, myself. So this is where I want to connect polarization to a concept that might feel more personal if you've done some growth or spiritual work, and that is the ego, the self. At its simplest, ego is a sense of I. The part of you that says me, mine, myself, and distinguishes me from you or you from others. In personal growth and spiritual contexts, ego often is pointing to the unhealed parts of us, the parts that still have pain, our conditioning, our old patterns, the personality traits that we developed to survive that pain. And all of that gets bundled into what I'd call the compulsive aspect of the psyche. So remember the DMN we talked about earlier, that narrator that builds that self-story. That is what the ego maps itself onto. Ego is the personal level. That's the DMN protecting me. And when that scales outward, then we get polarization. That's the DMN protecting us against them. So ego might sound like, I'm not racist, I'm a good person. Polarization is when that expands outward into my group is right and your group is wrong. So it's the same wiring, but it's just scaled up. It's kind of like a continuum. Ego is like the seed. Polarization is like the forest. Same roots, different scale. And both come from pain. When we don't feel safe or our needs for recognition and belonging aren't met, the ego is going to tighten up and groups polarize. And this is happening in the brain neurologically. This is why it's so sticky. Our predictive brains crave certainty. We've talked before about how much the brain loves binaries, just like with the thermostat story. The brain would rather collapse into black and white than tolerate the ambiguity of the gray. My way is right, your way is wrong. That either or, it's easier for the brain than the complex reality of both and. Something like there is a temperature where it's most comfortable for me, and it causes someone else some discomfort. Dualism and dogma feel safer even when they keep us divided. They feel like certainty. Now, the good news is this wiring is not fixed. Neuroscience shows that mindfulness and compassion practices can quiet the DMN. They can reduce over-identification with that self-concept, the self-story, and strengthen the brain's ability to kind of toggle between the networks. So instead of being trapped in this, all about me kind of TV, it's like mindfulness hands you a remote. Okay. And then you can switch from the DMN channel to the present moment channel, which is where you access curiosity or compassion. And that flexibility to toggle is what gives you the pause button. So instead of being swept along by the story, you get a pause, a beat to notice what's happening in your body, the signals to recognize, oh, this is the story. This is the default mode network story. And then you can choose how to respond. That pause is the beginning of conscious choice. The difference between being run by that compulsion and stepping into connection. But to really see why this matters, we need to talk about what happens when we get stuck in dualism and dogma. When we rigidly identify with a side, our perception becomes really, really narrow. We stop being able to see nuance. We are separate. We are disconnected. We stop being able to connect. My whole identity gets wrapped up in being right and yours in not being wrong. And when that happens, relationship is now blocked. We can't resolve. And as we saw with the thermostat example, if I believe the thermostat at 72 is right and true, and you believe it's 68, and we can't see each other's truths, reconciliation is impossible. The end game of dualism is domination. One side must overpower the other. There's no option. When it's either or, it's either or. And when that happens, the roles often flip, and then the oppressed becomes the oppressor. If I'm forced to suffer through the thermostat at 68 today, tomorrow I'm going to show up early and I'm going to find a way to make sure it's set to 72. And the cycle continues, and that unhealed pain becomes resentment, which becomes vindictiveness, and nothing heals. And here's the deeper cost. Polarization pulls us away from what we really care about. I want to share a personal example. So recently, when Charlie Kirk was killed, my partner, Christian, and I were talking about the range of reactions we were seeing online. Some people were saying, have empathy, and others were saying, don't have empathy, and some even celebrating his death, okay? Christian was reflecting to me that in the past, he might have felt a sense of relief or satisfaction at his death. Even if he wouldn't have said it out loud, he might have felt it. This time, something different happened. So if you remember that mindfulness as a remote metaphor, Christian had what I call a freeze frame moment of mindfulness. He noticed, I would have reacted differently before. And instead of being swept away by that impulse, maybe to celebrate the death of someone whose political views are so different from his own, views that he feels are deeply harmful, he found space to explore what could be underneath, what was underneath. And what surfaced wasn't necessarily empathy for Charlie Kirk himself. It was grief. Grief about gun violence, which is actually the issue he cares so deeply about. Without being tied up in the dogma, he could reconnect with his real values. That draw towards dogma in the past had distracted him from the core issue that he's so passionate about, which is the gun violence. When we collapse into dogma and polarization, we lose track of what matters, of those intentions and our values, and being in alignment with those values. And then we get stuck in this reactivity instead. It's almost like getting lost in this long tunnel instead of being able to be wide in an open field of awareness. And I know Christian's heart. It is the purest of anyone I've met. And he would never wish ill on anyone. He wouldn't hurt a fly, and I mean that quite literally. He doesn't even want to kill a bug, okay? But even with those genuine intentions, that unchecked dogma and pain, really pain within himself, had previously prevented him from being in alignment with what he really cared about. And it disconnected him from his authentic, pure heart. I acknowledge how disagreement lights up those same neural networks as physical pain. So does social rejection. Looking at this within ourselves is painful. Disagreement, it doesn't just feel like a difference in opinion, it feels threatening in the body. And when we're threatened, we get even more entrenched in our side, our pole. I kind of picture it like a seesaw. Polarization is what happens when, one pole gets lifted higher and higher and the whole thing tilts. And then there's no balance. There's no ground to stand on. For me, mindfulness is like that fulcrum, that stable center point that lets us find balance even amidst the movement. And that doesn't mean I have to be opinionless. It doesn't mean I have to be afraid of the word genocide or to be afraid to use my voice. I can have an opinion. It's the attachment to it and the need for it to be right and the need for me to be right and the unwillingness to consider other opinions. That's what makes it polarizing. Attachment skews my perspective and keeps me from seeing clearly. But when I rest in mindfulness back at that fulcrum, I can hold my convictions and I can do it with enough openness to stay connected to the present moment, to what matters to me, to my intentions, and potentially the other person, even if we disagree. It's kind of like shining a flashlight. If the beam is too narrow, I only see one corner of the room or one part of it and mistake it for the whole. Mindfulness helps train my attention so I can have control over that flashlight. I can both narrow or widen the light from a place of choice. I can widen and not lose sight of my own beam and see it in context. That wider view allows me to stay connected to my values instead of being hijacked by the reactivity, which brings us to the next layer. If we're going to talk about staying connected, and we want to talk about getting to peace or oneness, we need to be really clear about what that means and what it does not mean. In a lot of spiritual circles, I've seen oneness often implicitly equated with sameness. Okay, so like if we could just all rise above identity, then we'd be free. We'd have peace. But that's not my orientation because that's not my lived experience. And it's not what I mean when I talk about oneness. I don't believe we need to transcend difference. I believe we need to transcend the aversion to difference and come to acceptance and see the value of difference. To share an experience of oneness, I don't need you to be the same as me, a mixed race, neurodivergent, neuroscience geek, okay? But I also don't want to have to abandon those aspects of my lived experience in order to create some illusion that we're the same. What both of us really needs is for our specific differences to be allowed, to be acknowledged, to be valued by each other. That's what inclusion means. Acknowledging that we are different. And those differences are beautiful and valuable, and we need each other's differences to see more clearly, to widen our view and perspective. And that is the heart of something I call the embodied spirituality paradigm, ESP. I'm going to talk about it more in next week's episode. But at its core, it's about integration of our light and our form, integration of our individuality and our shared humanity, integration of hard truths with the nervous system safety that allows for them to be received. Oneness can accommodate difference. It doesn't erase identity or lived experience. And this is where I want to bring in a nuance and clarify the difference between minimization and polarization. Now, I understand some people, often those in marginalized groups, right now especially, they are guarding against minimization. They are saying, if we do not name the real, systemic, widespread conditioning that is enabling these atrocities, then we are complicit. And that's a truth. That is a truth, and that truth matters. Naming harm is essential to creating space for justice and for repair. The focus of this conversation is on guarding against polarization, the kind that collapses individuals into symbols, assigns blame by association, and hardens people into positions that they cannot shift from. This is also a truth and matters, because once people's nervous systems shut down, they cannot metabolize truth, even if it's true, even if it's spoken. So the reality here is we need both. This is the both and. We need to name systemic truth so that we do not minimize harm, and we also need to create the conditions of safety so that truth can actually land, instead of triggering more defensiveness and collapse in people. And as frustrating as that might be, that's not softness. That's just biology. And it's important to say, this kind of openness, it does require some degree of reciprocity. Both people, Yes, they need at least some willingness to engage humanely. And of course, that is not always the case. And this is exactly what sacred neutrality is about. It's a practice of holding both truths, naming harm without collapsing into polarization, and creating the safety without minimizing the reality. Staying open does not mean tolerating harm. Hear me clearly on this. It does not mean staying in abusive dynamics or endlessly engaging with someone who's, trolling you or dehumanizing you. Sometimes the most skillful, compassionate thing you can do is walk away. To say, this conversation is not safe for me. I will not engage with that kind of language. There are limits of capacity. So if you notice yourself feeling numb or cynical or completely depleted, that, compassion fatigue or empathetic distress we've talked about, that means your system is overextended. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Sometimes the most wise and ethical thing you can do is rest so that you can return resourced. Our nervous systems don't just shift because we want them to, and neither does anybody else's nervous system. A nervous system needs safety and recovery and care. So please hear this. Sacred neutrality does not mean staying unprotected or not having a stance. Boundaries are a part of compassion. We talked about that last week, and I'm going to talk more about practically implementing that later in this episode. But let's talk a little bit more right now about what sacred neutrality actually looks like. I want to be clear about what I mean and what I don't mean. What I call compulsive straddling. It can look like, neutrality on the surface, but underneath, it's fear-driven. It's when, I stay quiet or avoid taking a stance because I'm afraid of being judged, or I don't want to cause conflict, or I'm not even sure what I think, and so I default to silence. And when I do that, if I do that, the focus is still on me. It's on how I'm going to be seen or perceived. That's ego. That's ego in action, even if it looks like peacekeeping. Now, conscious straddling, on the other hand, that is not about avoidance, it's about presence. It's the deliberate choice to hold both my conviction and my openness at the same time. I stay aware of my stance, I stay aware of yours, and I choose to engage in a way that keeps connection possible, even if and when we disagree. I don't abandon what matters to me, but I also hold it with enough softness and spaciousness that you can stay in the room with me. Spaciousness is space. There is space for you and me. This conscious straddling, this sacred neutrality, it is conviction plus openness. It's a way of saying, I know what I believe, and I'm also willing to keep my heart open to you as a human being who has experienced pain. I am willing to exist in that gray area with you and not put you or me in a box. And here's what the neuroscience tells us. The brain doesn't soften when it feels attacked. It only softens when it feels safe, which means if we want someone to even consider another perspective, the sequence matters. The sequence is regulate, relate, reason. First, I have to regulate myself, my own nervous system. Then I can relate to the other person, create enough safety so that the other person can stay with me. And my regulated nervous system will also impact them. Only then does reasoning and perspective taking come back online. So let's take a breath here and regulate, re-regulate together. All right. I want to take you through another brief embodied practice to help build up the muscle to regulate in real time. This is another teaching point, and this is going to use the power of visualization as well. We are going to talk about how powerful the tool of mental rehearsal is for rewiring the brain in a few weeks. So if you feel safe, you can close your eyes. If not, that's fine. But allow yourself to go inward, take a breath, become present, and recall a time, maybe recently, when you had a disagreement with someone that you care about. Partner, friend. And it doesn't have to be super high stakes, something that feels approachable for you. Sibling, loved one, whatever. And as you bring this disagreement to mind, revisiting that moment, connect to your body as well. And notice where you feel sensations or activation. Noticing what you feel emotionally as well. And you're not judging it, you're just being aware. And this energy is here. It's here, it's inside, and it's needing some attention. So from this place of noticing that activation, go ahead and find your anchor for support from earlier. Find your anchor and allow it to help regulate you with the discomfort, bringing you back to the present moment, anchoring you to safety. So maybe that was your hands on your thighs, your hands on your heart, your feet on the ground, bending over, whatever feels supportive. So just breathe for your moment, connected to your anchor. And while you're there, notice your story at the same time. You're still aware of your story, but you're not judging it. Notice what is your story. Maybe it's something like, I'm right and they're wrong. Or they don't get me. Get a sense of, this is yours. It's my story. And just as you do this, soften your body. Intentionally maybe drop your shoulders, unclench your jaw, invite softness. And notice how you are coexisting with this. And then, as you regulate through this, you are regulating through this right now, take a moment to consider the other person in this dynamic's experience and what might their story have been. So right now, imagine asking them, what matters to you here? And just see what they say. Notice what that offers you. If it gives you any insight. How might you navigate moving forward knowing that truth about them? What shifts in your mind, your heart, your body even? And then just recognize that you're both human. You both carry suffering. You both have truths. And you both want to be relieved of that suffering. So silently, just offer this person, may you be relieved of your suffering. And offer it to yourself as well. May I be relieved of my suffering. And take a deep breath. Feel your anchor, feel yourself sitting in your body, present and safe. And if your eyes were closed, you can open them. So you just practiced connecting to this sacred neutrality in your body. Notice how you regulated, how you still had your own opinion, but were you able to open up to the other person's truth? And if you couldn't, that's okay. Notice how this feels in your body. Even if you're feeling closed off or protective or defensive, this is the work. But without it, without this work, without sacred neutrality, we are either going to collapse into avoidance, or it's going to intensify into needing to dominate, to overpower. With sacred neutrality, we create space for something different, for truth to be spoken and received. In the mindfulness world, there's a concept called equanimity. It's the capacity to stay even and regulated, even amidst distress. And there's a saying that I love. It's strong back, soft front. And it captures this energy of equanimity somatically. I can have a strong spine, grounded, boundaried, clear, and at the same time, keep my heart open and soft. Equanimity and mindfulness, they don't mean, closing our eyes and escaping the pain of the world. They mean, how can I stay present in the midst of it? Now, as a coach, I've worked with clients who have biases and beliefs that are sometimes very different than my own. Coaching requires me to be objective, as objective as an inherently subjective human can be, of course. But in order to hold space for their truth without collapsing into my own, I have to take on that non-judgment. My job, as I see it, is to be non-judgmental. And I understand, every coach might not see it this way, but non-judgment is one of my greatest values, and living in alignment with that has, I think, been my biggest opportunity for growth. Sacred neutrality doesn't mean I agree with these clients. It means I stay present enough to actually hear them and to see and hold space for their humanity. I keep my heart open, which allows them to feel safe. And then there's a possibility, if there's an exchange, for them to be more likely to listen in return. And I know that, I'm speaking in the context of coaching, which is very different than as a friend, but I have a few examples I'd like to share that have been helpful, because this can be challenging, especially in coaching contexts. So I had one client who expressed frustration at her husband's lack of emotional connection. And she kept coming back to this story that, I think he's on the spectrum, as if that were an inherently limiting factor. Now, being on the spectrum myself, when I first heard this, it stung. And I have had a lot of clients use autism or being on the spectrum as a pejorative because, people are just largely uneducated about it. And sometimes, it hurts. And yes, it's her bias. And yes, it's fair to me that it hurts. I'm entitled to that hurt. But when I'm not lost in my hurt, when I'm not personalizing it, when I'm not coming from my wounds and my pain, then I can just see it without judgment. Oh, this is their bias. This is their shit. This actually has nothing to do with me. Now, if I had reacted and called her out on her bias in the moment, which maybe I had a right to do, okay? But if I had done that, that wouldn't have gone anywhere helpful because there's not safety. Her nervous system, would have been hijacked. So I didn't say anything the first few times. I stayed present to myself. I regulated through it. But after we had built enough trust, I decided one day, I'm going to disclose my diagnosis to her. And she was blown away. She could not believe it. She couldn't believe it because of my, emotional capacity. And she experienced me as so warm and able to skillfully hold space for her. And it totally shifted the way that she related to autism and opened her up. She went from black and white to possibility for her husband's capacity. She opened up to options for how to navigate it. So rather than seeing it as black or white with, the bias that if he's on the spectrum, he can't express emotion, my vulnerability and grounding and safety helped her open to that gray area of possibility. Oh, maybe that bias isn't true. Now, I will also share, this is one of my favorite clients who has actually become a really good friend. Now, she was one of the first clients I ever disclosed to a few years ago. And after she had told me how profoundly my self-disclosure impacted her. And that's when I realized the value of me sharing with others could be helpful. So this is an example of how both of us have benefited and learned from this exchange. I'll share another example. I've had clients who express hate for Muslims. This is painful. This is, me. I grew up in a Muslim household. And, in those moments, I have a choice in how I respond. Yes, it's their bias. Maybe I have a right to react. But often, if I pause and respond, I can actually see that their words are rooted in their own pain. And sometimes, again, sometimes, if there's enough trust in the relationship, I'll share my own experiences. Maybe like the fear that I felt in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected and instituted a Muslim ban, or what it was like to be Muslim in America during that time. Because there's trust and safety, and I've held space for their story, then they are open to potentially hearing mine. And when they do, sometimes something shifts. They might even come a little closer toward my position, not because I attacked them, but because I touched their heart with my humanity, my vulnerability. And again, this isn't about me changing their opinion. I learn from them too. So I think of a Jewish client that I have who shared his pain around his children experiencing anti-Jewish hate at school, and how deeply he resonated with the film Inglourious Bastards, wishing that that kind of justice had been real. And hearing that really moved me, because it gave me a glimpse into the generational pain and longing that is carried in his community. And other Jewish clients that I've had have vulnerably shared their fear. I'm not saying this is representative of everyone, but I've had some people tell me that they fear Jews could be on the wrong side of history as they watch violence enacted, against Palestinians in the name of Jewish people. Listening to that, it helps open my heart. It helps me feel their humanity and the weight that they carry. To meet in a more conscious center, without abandoning our convictions or our experience or our pain, and finding our shared humanity, that's conscious straddling. I'm aware of my stance, I'm aware of theirs, and I'm deliberately holding enough non-judgmental space for us to both stay in the conversation and perhaps move a little bit closer to each other. Sometimes that might mean speaking, sometimes it doesn't. That's where, the essence of mindfulness comes into action. It depends, and I have to be able to regulate myself. It's the capacity to stay aware of myself internally and externally while in relationship with another, and to make a discerning, intentional choice about what will best serve the moment. And sometimes their pain takes up so much space that, I sense they couldn't stay open to a stance that challenges them, even if I share from my heart. And in those moments, my choice is to keep listening. Other times, when the trust and the groundedness are there, then I can self-disclose or share an opinion, and it might deepen the connection. That's conscious straddling. And it's the bridge that makes conversations possible across divides. Sometimes people feel like that isn't fair, and sometimes it isn't fair. Life isn't fair. But mindfulness has been so helpful for me because it's not about judging anything as good or bad or fair or unfair. It just is. So it might not be fair. I might be right. The other person might be wrong. And there's a quote that I use with clients sometimes. It's, do you want to be right or do you want to be in relationship? Sometimes you might be right. And proving that you're right isn't how you're going to get through and be heard. It's that wounded ego, that unhealed pain. That's the part that's wanting to be right. And in that moment, if I submit to ego reacting and running the show because of my pain, I miss that opportunity for that person to receive. I want to share another moment from my personal life, because when the stakes felt highest for me, this practice changed everything. And looking back, I can see that this was my kind of catalyst to mindfulness practice as I'm talking about it today in this episode. So this goes back to 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president. I was scared. As a Muslim, there was talk about creating this Muslim registry. I was worried for my family. I was worried for my safety. And I felt that in my body every day when I'd wake up or turn on the news or move through the world, this, tightness in my chest and a racing heart and a pit in my stomach. And at first it felt like swing between these extremes. I would obsessively consume news as if it might give me some sense of control. And then it would be too much. And I would shut it all out because it was too overwhelming. I just could not regulate through it. And during Trump's first presidency, I was on a meditation retreat. That's something that I do every year regularly for my own growth. And that's where I learned loving kindness meditation. It's sometimes called metta. And it's simple but powerful. You silently repeat phrases of goodwill. May you be happy. May you be safe. And you do this toward different categories of people. You do it toward what's called a benefactor, or like an easy person, toward yourself, a friend, a neutral person, and a difficult person. For my difficult person, I chose Donald Trump. Now, side note, I would not recommend starting with someone that's that triggering for you unless you already have a grounded meditation practice, and foundation and some skilled support there. And I had that. Now, I didn't choose him because I wanted to forgive him or agree with him. I chose him because he was difficult for me. I chose him because even the thought of him made me reactive. And I didn't want to live my life at the mercy of that reactivity. The practice is there to relieve my own suffering. So I practiced it on retreat, and then I continued, and over months of this daily practice, something shifted in me. The tension in my chest, at the sound of his name, it started to fade. I didn't start liking him. I didn't start agreeing with him. But I began to see he was this hurt human. And there's that saying, hurt people hurt people. Research backs this up. People who experience trauma are more likely to harm others. Trauma literally changes the brain. It wires us for protection and for defense at all costs. When you see that in someone, it becomes harder to only see them as a monster, and it's easier to recognize there's a wounded human under there. Hurt people hurt people. And this isn't just about one person or one moment in history. This is a human pattern. When pain and fear are not healed, they don't just disappear. They get passed forward. The oppressed can become the oppressor, not because they were born that way, but because unhealed trauma keeps the nervous system in that survival mode. And we're even learning this scientifically. Studies of descendants of Holocaust survivors show increased stress reactivity, evidence that trauma can echo across generations. That doesn't mean cycles of harm are inevitable, but it shows how pain that isn't healed, it ripples out forward, shaping how safe or unsafe people can feel in the world long after the event itself. And so we can see this in the story of Donald Trump too. Accounts describe his father as harsh and emotionally abusive, and his brother Fred actually died really young from alcoholism. Now, perhaps Fred's pain turned inward instead of outward. Trump's wounds maybe show up differently, projected outward in ways that harm other people. I don't share this potential perspective to excuse his choices, but it humanizes the cycle. Trauma unhealed doesn't vanish. It repeats, whether toward self or others. And then I know that the question becomes, okay, well, what do we do about that? How does my individual practice solve genocide or systemic oppression? And the honest answer is it doesn't, not directly. That's talking about this at the macro level. And this conversation, this practice is about the micro level. You and me, one nervous system at a time. Because if we can't stay regulated and connected in our everyday lives, we will not have any capacity to take meaningful, responsive action at the macro level. So this is not replacing activism or policy. It's what's making those things possible without us recreating the same cycles of harm from our reactivity. This is why the inner work matters. It is the only thing, I believe, that can interrupt that cycle. And we can't really be healing other people's trauma. We have to start with our own. We have to start with ourselves. And not to say that we have to, do it until we're finished or that we're ever fully healed. But until I could regulate myself, I could not hold space for others, which meant I really couldn't understand them. Think about that word, understand. Break that word down. I find it so helpful because it really means to stand beneath. To understand is to stand beneath, not in a way where I'm abandoning myself, but where I'm staying curious about your experience. Without that, no change is possible. If you go back to that thermostat example earlier, if I can understand that you get migraines when it's warm, or that your arthritis flares up when it's too cold, or you can understand that my, circulation is poor, or the cold air worsens my breathing issues, then something shifts. And without that, we stay stuck. There's no change that's possible. And I know the thermostat feels benign compared to the reality of people dying. It is benign, and it's meant to be, because the truth is this neurological pattern that I'm pointing to, it doesn't just change because, the stakes are higher or because our pain feels unbearable. Your nervous system, my nervous system, everybody's nervous system, it's working the way it's working. We cannot outthink this wiring, this biology. And if we can't practice regulation, if we can't practice curiosity in these small conflicts, we're not going to have access to that when the big ones come. And that's exactly where my personal story comes in, because these cycles of harm, they're not just abstract. They show up in me, in my real life, and how I relate. So let me share what I learned through my experience with Donald Trump. I do not like Donald Trump. And I also don't carry reactivity toward him anymore. That shift for me doesn't mean I condone his words or his actions, but that shift is because I became less afraid of him. Fear wasn't taking over my nervous system. I could regulate myself and can now stay regulated when his name comes up in conversation or in the news. I can hold my ground and I can hold my heart at the same time. I can stay in the room. And from that place, I can actually take more effective action for change. If I had stayed neutral because I was afraid to have an opinion, again, that would be compulsive straddling. But choosing to soften my reactivity so that I could see his humanity underneath while still holding my own convictions, learning to regulate, that's conscious straddling. And science backs this up too. So there's a study by Kang and colleagues from 2014. It found that just a few weeks of loving kindness practice measurably reduced implicit bias. I found this study in grad school, and I used it to design a DEI initiative at a past organization that I worked at. And participants in this, report their own biases softening towards group that they previously judged. And this is using the IAT, the implicit association test, to judge it. This isn't just like, oh, I think you can't, guess if your implicit bias has changed. For me, mindfulness has done more than just reduce anxiety or help me calm down. Those are like side benefits. What it's really done, the power of it for me, has been to change the way my brain relates to things. It's given me intimate awareness of my own reactions so that I can choose how I want to respond instead of being in reactivity and run by those reactions. When someone voices an opinion that is different than mine, I have the capacity to notice. And what that means is I notice the clenching in my chest. I notice the tightness in my throat, the judgments, the stories in my head about, why they're wrong. That still happens. Why my arguments are coming up to show me, to assert why I'm right. Notice the me, the ego. It's still there. But the difference is I can be aware of it without becoming it. There's space. That's the freeze frame moment. I have access to that wider menu of choices for how I might respond more compassionately and also more effectively. That's the inner work, training the brain and the nervous system to respond differently so that we can stay in difficult conversations without losing ourselves. And this has allowed me to have conversations with people who have different opinions, trusting that the safety of both of us being regulated and them feeling seen and feeling my humanity, both of our humanity, there's a chance that maybe they think more broadly and less narrowly about their own views, and some I know have. If this episode has challenged you in any way, I get it. This is not easy. This is why I started this episode with that safety anchor. We all need a safe place to land while we navigate these challenging topics. And what I see happening right now, especially on social media, people are screaming through their pain, trying to force others to feel the temperature of the air as they do. And I understand why. We scream when the pain feels unbearable. I have felt it too. I still feel it sometimes. But what I've seen is that screaming does not create long-term change. No one has ever changed because I yell at them enough. If you feel frustrated with what I'm saying, I get it. I understand. My question is, are you sitting down and having one-on-one conversations with humans who have different opinions from the heart while regulated, trying to understand? Because that's how the change that I believe most people want is going to occur. It just doesn't compute for me how we can get to peace, and oneness by perpetuating harm in these poles. How to do that without becoming the oppressor. And I want to be clear, I am not implying that everyone needs to be having those one-on-one conversations right now. Sometimes it isn't safe for your body or your nervous system isn't just there yet, or with certain people it's not safe. If you can do it, great. If you can't, that's okay too. We're going to talk more about how. What matters is that you do your own work, because change starts from the inside out. Again, in a moment, I'm going to share some practical ways for you to approach this inner work safely so that it doesn't feel overwhelming. I also want to say, I really don't believe all extremes are bad. Sometimes we do need to stretch ourselves beyond our comfort zones. But the real question is, can we do it in a way that feels safe enough for our system so that we stay regulated and connected instead of either collapsing or exploding? What I do wish is that we could stop yelling at each other about what we are or aren't doing and start encouraging each other to really look deeply at ourselves. That starts with being curious about our own reactions and then extending that curiosity outward toward others. This is hard. This work that I'm suggesting here, it is a lot harder than screaming. It's changing people one person at a time, starting with me, myself. I have to be able to regulate myself. And again, it's not fair. But our nervous systems don't care about fairness. They care about safety. And until we work with that reality, nothing is going to change. I can recognize that my heart resonates with free Palestine because of my own pain. And I can also not close off my heart to the pain that's happening for people who take another side. And from that regulated place, then it's possible for me to take action. I can donate to support Gaza aid and offer humanitarian support to Palestine. I can write Congress. I can educate myself. These are all things I've done and continue to do. And I can still keep my heart open to all the suffering. I said this in the episode on compassion. There's so much suffering in the world. There is so much suffering. We have to take care of ourselves. We are no good to anyone else, no matter how much terrible pain is happening, if we can't regulate and feel safe within ourselves. And we are not going to move anyone else's hearts from a dysregulated place. And I know some of you might be thinking, one nervous system at a time? I mean, that's going to take too long. We don't have time for this. There's too much suffering and killing happening right now. I know. I feel that too. The urgency is real. It's real. But what I've come to believe is that even breaking this binary, the macro and the micro also don't compete. They are interdependent. Yes, we need protests and policy and collective action. But if we try to skip the inner work, we end up replicating harm in how we show up. In his speech, How Long, Not Long, Martin Luther King Jr., he said, "The road ahead is not altogether a smooth one. There are no broad highways that lead us easily and inevitably to quick solutions, but we must keep going." He reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's how I see this work. It's not fast, it's not easy, but it's what makes lasting change possible. The vision is long-term, and it begins with you, within each of us. My sister Nadia, she's my social responsibility consultant, and she supported me with developing this episode. And a metaphor that she shared with me is that, each of us is like this tiny little sliver of a very long timeline that will continue unfolding long after, each of us is gone, each of us is dead. And my responsibility is to show up and do my part in this little sliver of history where I find myself. That arc of the moral universe bends towards justice because we collectively show up to take the action that bends it in that direction. We have to take action. When we learn to regulate, to stay present, and to open instead of collapse, that's what strengthens the action, the movements, the policies, the protests. That's what ensures we don't recreate the same cycles of harm that we're trying to end. And this inner work is what makes the outer work possible. Because once we learn to notice our own reactivity and soften it, we can show up differently in conversations and in communities and in the world. So let's talk about how that looks in practice so that it can actually become action, not just an idea or a concept. First, let's talk about the inner work. I really recommend a daily mindfulness practice. And when I say mindfulness, I mean mindfulness meditation. Meditation, again, it's not just about lowering anxiety. That's kind of like a side effect. What it really does, or what it's done for me, is given the ability to see your stream of consciousness more clearly, to recognize that story, that DMN story as it's happening, and to respond rather than react. And that matters because it lets you stay clear about your convictions while also seeing this wider, fuller picture. Your actions then can come from alignment with yourself, your truth, your values, instead of reactivity coming from your pain. Just earlier this week, I posted what I call dessert practice with the Monday episode, and that is for a mindfulness meditation practice. If you want to find it either in the podcast app or in the description of this episode, I've linked it again if you want to try it out. You could also try a loving kindness practice. I did another dessert practice. There's a recording to guide you through it. It's posted with this episode. So that's the practice I shared with you earlier. And if you choose to try that, start with, a benefactor, which is an easy person, yourself, a friend, a neutral person. And then if you're ready, a difficult person. Again, don't choose your most difficult, traumatizing, activated person in your life. If you're new to this work, keep it simple. But even one or two phrases offered to someone else in a moment when you feel activated, that may you be safe, may you be well, that can retrain your nervous system over time. So that practice is there for you. Something else to do is notice selfing. Selfing is being mindful of that ego, that unhealed pain. Notice within yourself, or when you're listening to others talk, how often you or other people use the word me or I or mine. How often do you make it about you, or does someone make it about them? You understand now, of course, that this is just the nature of the brain and the nature of that default mode network when we're on autopilot. But that tendency to make it about me, that ego, is also, in a spiritual sense, our unhealed pain. And it can point us to our work. So an experiment, just try in conversation, try speaking without making it about me. Can you not even use the word me or I and see what happens? I've done this before many times. It's really fascinating. Something else to do for inner work is body check-ins. Pause and notice throughout the day what's happening in your body. What are the sensations? Where's there tension? Is my jaw tight? Are my shoulders lifted? Is my stomach clenching? These are cues that are telling you when your nervous system is getting pulled into that threat mode. So get to know what your body is telling you. And do this as much as you can, but start to especially do it when you're in dialogue or conversation with someone, especially who has a different opinion than you, or when you're consuming social media content. Notice what happens in your body. I want to also remind you about the blips practice I shared, back in the first week of launching. I think it launched September 10th. I did a really short episode, but then there's a dessert practice of these 5 steps that you can take in a minute or so to reset your system so that you can show up in your day with more intention. These are all ways to train your brain, your body for that mental flexibility so that when conflict does show up, you're not meeting it from a place of compulsion or pain, but from choice. Before we move on to the outer work, one other thing I want to say about the inner work is that when you are engaging online, I see a lot of people taking a side out of fear because there's a lot of pressure. You take a side because you don't want to be associated with the side that you're defaulted to if you don't take one. This is about that pain of ego and belonging. I want you to just notice that and remember it's okay to be with yourself. It's okay to pause. It's okay to be quiet and get clear about what matters to you and what you want to say so that you're actually, when you use your voice, contributing instead of just matching and perpetuating noise that's being rippled out within the same pole, okay? Give yourself permission to pause and be quiet. It's okay. Now let's talk about outer work. So the inner work is what's going to make the outer work possible, but the outer work is the growth that's going to happen in relationship. As you reflect on your own conversations, ask yourself that question. Do I want to be right or do I want to be in relationship? That is the pivot from ego to connection, from me to us. So if your first impulse is, well, I don't want to be in relationship with those people, notice that. Now, I'm not saying you have to be in relationship with everyone. Boundaries matter. But if, on one hand, you feel the right to tell someone what to think or feel, and you want them to hear you, but you do not want to be in relationship with them, why should they listen to you? Because you're right? That's ego talking. Do you see what I'm saying? Even logically, it just doesn't make sense, because in polarization, we are not leading with logic. We are being led by pain and emotions. In my experience, this kind of openness, the willingness to stay vulnerable, to stay in vulnerable conversation, it's going to happen more often with people that I know and care about, where there's some incentive to work through the hard stuff. And what I see less often is people practicing, this with people closest to them. Instead, it's like a lot of yelling at strangers on social media, discharging that pain. I understand the pain behind it, but the ripple of change, it starts at the micro level in our actual relationships, in spaces where there's enough connection to make the vulnerability worthwhile. And I've seen how devastating it is when even family relationships fracture under this kind of pain. So an example, a personal example, my mom, who is white, but converted to Islam when she married my dad, who is Pakistani, she struggled to stay connected with her own brother because of the hateful things he would post online about Muslims. And it's heartbreaking to watch how polarization can cut through families, leaving people estranged sometimes. And it shows just how high the cost can be when we lose that capacity to stay in relationship. Change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in conversations, especially with people who see things differently than we do. Telling a stranger on the street that they are wrong, it's not likely to change anything. It'll probably just push them further away. But maybe with your cousin, your aunt, your parent, someone that you would still show up to a Thanksgiving or a holiday or, birthday dinner with, then there's some foundation of care. The question is, can we each do enough of our own work to stay regulated so that we can be present and curious and invite them into even deeper relationship where we actually care about each other's pain? Being human is hard. And different identities carry different pains and weights. Being Black or brown in America is hard. Being Jewish in America right now is hard. Being Muslim in America is hard. Being neurodivergent, trans, queer, disabled, being different in America right now is hard. Every identity carries its own pain. And deciding whose pain is more painful or more justified, it's not helpful and it's not possible. And the impulse to do that comes from my unhealed pain and ego. My pain is worse. This is not about comparing suffering. It's about remembering we all have suffering. The work is to meet in our shared humanity without abandoning our convictions. So I have some suggestions if you want to explore conversations with other people. First is to set an intention. I do this for almost every courageous conversation I have with a friend or family member, not just about, polarization or politics, but anything. I go to this person and I start with, I want to talk about something with you, and it's a kind of challenging topic, but my intention is to be closer to you. I can see that this thing is getting in the way of our closeness and our connection, so I would like to explore it, and I would love if we could both be open and curious. Are you open to that? So this invites them in. It invites them to agree and to participate in a heart-led way. It sets a container for safety for the conversation. To even do that is vulnerable. You know, if someone said that to you, would you want to meet them there? Yeah. The next thing is to lead with curiosity and with a genuine willingness to understand. Curiosity means open and not knowing. So ask curious questions, not leading ones. Open, tell me more. You know, what about this matters to you? And try to reflect back what you hear. You know, I hear you saying XYZ. That makes sense. Or I hear you saying you feel afraid. I've been feeling afraid too. In this conversation, it's not the time for arguments. It's about understanding. The brain's defenses lower when you feel heard, and that creates space for the perspective to shift. Safety in the nervous system is necessary. The next thing is mutual learning. The goal is not to erase differences or change another's opinion. The goal is to hold space for each other and for your humanity long enough to find that shared ground. Your goal cannot be to change the other person's opinion. It has to be to understand. And sometimes that means both people moving a little closer to the center, not by abandoning convictions, but by touching the other person's heart through your story and through your presence. If you want someone else to learn from you, what might you learn from them? Even if you believe you're right and they're wrong, if you believe you're right and you're wrong, first of all, your perspective is probably skewed and you're in a binary. I have to come back to what's possible for me to learn from this person. The next tip is to stay grounded in these hard conversations. Regulation is first. In coaching, I've worked with clients I mentioned whose political beliefs were, completely opposite of mine, including the Trump supporters. And that role, it's really been a gift. It's in kind of requiring and challenging me to be objective. It's been this opportunity to practice sacred neutrality, being present, keeping my heart open, making space for their truth while holding on to my own. The gift of coaching has given me the time to build the skill. And I will acknowledge it's much harder to do with people in my family or friends, but it is possible. One thing I'll do during those conversations, is have a somatic anchor. So we connected to an anchor today, but I'll have a somatic anchor. Like one thing I'll do is rub my middle finger and my thumb together. You can try it now. Just rub your middle finger and thumb together and just notice the sensation of your fingertips touching. Just bring your attention there. If you're noticing that sensation of the fingertips, the rubbing, then you are present. This sensation can only happen now. This is a way I come back. And I can be doing this when I'm talking to anyone or placing a hand on my heart. There's not one right way. Anything that helps you bring you back into your body, that's going to be a gateway to presence. In these conversations, the intention is to hold emotional space for their pain, theirs and yours, without collapsing. You don't have to agree with their position, but you can still acknowledge their pain. Seeing someone's humanity, that's often the only thing that makes real change possible. So you could validate that pain by saying, ugh, that sounds really heavy. You can also acknowledge it without abandoning your truth. Wow, even though I don't see it the same way, I get how scary this is for you. Simple reflections like that acknowledge and validate instead of invalidate. And it doesn't have to require an agreement between the two of you. It keeps that space for the both and instead of the dualism, which is the either or. And sometimes that's uncomfortable. And I think that's the next tip is let it be uncomfortable. Sometimes closeness and intimacy and vulnerability are uncomfortable. Connection is a sharing of our emotional experience, and it's an exchange in that. And so vulnerability is messy at times. It's rarely comfortable. The vulnerability here is really setting your own ego aside in service of the relationship, letting go of the me to make space for the we. With poles, with the polarization, the black and white feel safe, they feel certain, they feel familiar, and that's why we gravitate towards them. When you choose to go into that gray and live in that possibility and unknown, it is uncomfortable. It is unfamiliar. So that's what you're signing up for with this work. The next suggestion is to share your own story when it feels safe. Stories bridge divides, and they do that in a way that arguments just can't. But the key is safety. The relationship has to hold enough trust first. I also suggest having some boundary scripts, if you will, okay? So sometimes you got to draw a line of what's okay and what's not okay. And it could be something as simple as like, I'm not going to engage in dehumanizing language. This doesn't align with my values. Okay, that protects your integrity while also keeping the door open. The goal is not to win the conversation. The goal is to create conditions for openness. You plant a seed, you offer humanity, and you trust that it grows over time. Sometimes the shift isn't immediate. My suggestion is to start with people you know, friends, family, people where there's some incentive to stay in the room. And again, the irony is a lot of people I know avoid conversations with family and people who have different political approaches. And then they're like going and screaming their opinion to strangers. That screaming of their opinion to strangers is a discharge. It's an expression of their pain. That's not in service of change or activism. I will say for myself personally, I mentioned coaching being like this gift. In your profession, if you have to engage with people where it feels like there's some level of professionalism where you would talk to someone differently in that role than you would with a family member, that could also be a really good opportunity to practice noticing that regulation, because you probably have more presence and intention in how you're going to show up in that relationship and in that conversation. Okay? But trust yourself on this. I hope you can see that today my goal has not been to change your opinions or your view. And yet, you now are aware of mine. And my hope is that now you can see what I mean. The feeling of being in relationship where you can have your opinion without being judged. The people that I coach, my clients, they trust me to challenge them because they know I am never judging them. And I'm not judging you. I'm challenging you to look at yourself, your own mind, your own pain, regardless of your opinion, in service of the relief of your own suffering and for you to be in alignment with what's actually true for you, not having lost sight of it because of your pain. I've also linked some books in the show notes, some other resources that might resonate if you want to check those out. Growth doesn't happen on our own. It happens in relationship. That relationship starts with ourselves, and then it widens out to others. It happens in the hard conversations where we practice staying regulated and curious and connected, again, with ourselves first. And it happens when we stretch, sometimes into discomfort. Change does not happen without getting uncomfortable. But we have to do it in a way that keeps us safe enough to stay in the room, in our window of tolerance. We are all on different journeys. We're on different paths. We have different pains, different histories, and we may need different parts of our work right now. Maybe, at one point you need more inner, and at another you need more outer, or you're kind of, shifting between them. No one else can tell you what's true for you and what you need. And if anyone tries to, frankly, don't trust them. I encourage you to trust people who encourage you to listen to yourself and challenge you to look at yourself from a place of kindness so that you can actually grow. We are all human. We are all fucked up, and we are all in pain. And that's just the way it is. We suffer when we fight that reality, when we resist what is. Mindfulness, it's meeting what is. This is what's here. And sometimes what's here sucks. And it's painful. And it's not fair. So with that, I want to leave you with a couple of bullet points or themes to carry forward. One is that ego and polarization are the same machinery, but scaled. Ego protects me. Polarization protects us. Same roots, different size. The next is that safety has to happen before the shift. No one changes their mind when they feel under threat. Regulation and safety have to come first. It's not soft, it's biology. And conscious straddling is conviction plus openness, holding what you believe while keeping your heart open to the humanity of the other person. Being pulled toward a side is normal, it's human. But the choice to stay open, even amidst that feature of your brain, that's power. That's what's going to change us individually and ripple out to change the world. And I want to remind you of this, that if you have made it here, if you have listened all the way through, wow, just take a moment to acknowledge the compassion in your heart and your emotional adaptability, flexibility, resilience. You would not have stayed with this conversation if you were not a capable, compassionate human being. And I see you. And I know this is not easy work, but it's important. It matters. If you want to try practicing, because everything I've been talking about with mindfulness, it's related to embodiment. Change happens when we embody it, not when we think about it cognitively. You've had embodied practices woven throughout this episode, but change is going to happen when you start embodying it every day. So there's this loving kindness meditation as a dessert practice if you want to try it out. If you do, please let me know how it goes for you. I would love to hear how the practice is, how this episode resonated with you. Maybe share it with someone else. Maybe sharing it with another person, either someone who has a similar view or a different view, could invite curiosity or bring you into conversation together. And if this podcast has supported you in some way, I really appreciate you leaving a review, giving it a 5-star rating. It really helps more people find it. And that means more people can practice connection to themselves and humanity in a divided world. Now, I know this podcast is about relishing, savoring life. And sometimes we have to face the hard stuff so that we can really be present to the abundance that is here. So thank you for your heart, your presence, your willingness to look inward. I appreciate you. I admire you. And I will see you next week.